All right, so this week we're wrapping up a mini-series, if you want to call it, on tolerant submission versus unrequited love, okay? And first week we picked on the women, the second week we picked on the man, and this week we'll kind of continue picking on the man, but then we're going to wrap the whole thing up, okay? And so we're on part 3 of this. And so before we even, our primary passage is Ephesians 5:22 through 33, but before we get to even the primary passage, I want to open with the leading verse of that passage. And it's submitting to one another in the fear of God. So we already hit the word submit in verse 21. And this was about singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with one another and submitting to one another in the fear of God. And we looked at the word submitting. And we found out that submitting truly is what we all fear that submit means, and it's to yield to one's admonition or advice absolutely. And that is a warning or strong reprimand is what an admonition is, and to yield to it absolutely. So that truly is what the word and what the intent is behind the word submit. And like I said, the first week we picked on the wives, where we said, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife. And we pointed out that Paul is specifically addressing the women on submitting to their husbands. And so we talked about how Paul was telling the women, he wasn't telling the men how to tell the women to submit to their husbands. Paul was telling the women how they are to submit to their husbands and as to the Lord. And then as a reminder for the men, mainly I'm only going to cover one of the two definitions of what submit is not. And we talked about how submit is not subservient, okay? Serving or acting as a subordinate. And we learned that subordinate, it doesn't sound so bad when you say it this way, serving or acting as a subordinate. Until you look at the definition of subordinate, it says placed or in or belonging to a lower order or rank of less importance, inferior. So, men, our wives are not inferior to us when they submit to us. They are not subservient to us. And depending on women, you don't have to be that one bowing before your husband on the left. And men, you don't club your wife like a caveman and drag her off. Otherwise, she'll give you the look that cave woman has in that picture, okay? So let's go ahead and jump into and read the primary passage. We're in Ephesians chapter 5. We're starting with verse 22. And we are going to read the whole passage, but we're only covering the last third or so of it today. It says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church. And he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So last time, was 2 weeks ago, I looked at it from the viewpoint as Christ as our example on men loving their wives, right? We all find it interesting that we have to be told to love our wives, but wives don't have to be told to love their husbands, because love comes a little bit more naturally to the woman than to the man, okay? But submitting is a whole other thing. Okay, and so we saw again where it says in verse 25, it says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. So we saw again that Paul is specifically addressing the husbands here. Okay, so he had his go at the women, and he wrapped in the church about talking about the church, and I mentioned how when he said, as Christ loved the church is going to be, oh, wait, I thought he was talking to the wives. He was. And now when you hear about the church, we see that example that we're supposed to follow on wives submitting to their husbands, and on husbands love your wives just as Christ loved the church. And so as part of that, we talked about how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. We need to identify or we need to define what love means. And it's really great because the Bible does great things. When we are told to do something, it tells us what that looks like. And that looks like, we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 8a, we taught some of the high points. I won't re-preach this message, but I want to bring us into the scope of what we're covering today. So with Christ as our example in loving the church, so shall we love our wives, is suffers long, is kind. You know, I use a verse that's like a soft answer turns away wrath. How many husbands don't need to practice on returning a soft answer? Okay, it does not parade itself, is not puffed up. So, as pointing out how us men, a lot of times we want our wives to recognize and just laud over how great a thing we did for them, and we don't do it in return for everything great thing they do for us on a daily basis. Okay, it is does not behave rudely, does not seek his own, is not provoked. I use an example of a bear. You know, poking the bear. You can be the bear and you can be poked, but don't be provoked, okay? Because bears all things. Also, the wife can be the poking, but somebody's got to be the bigger person, okay? We in a marriage, is interesting is that we are truly ourselves with our spouses, are we not? You know, we put on a good show sometimes when we go out in public. But when we're in the household and we're in behind closed doors, you know, we sometimes could work on our behavior towards each other. And that's what Paul is pointing out when he tells us, wives submit and when men love. Okay, bears all things, endures all things. And the main thing is love never fails. You don't get to quit, don't get to hang up your hat, you don't get to retire from being married, okay? It never fails. So love never fails. Okay, and then we talked about what I think was one of the important pieces from last time, is that in verse 26 that he, Christ, still talking about the church, might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word. And we use this kind of as demands a foundation for belief and for doctrine and for structure and to be the leader of the home. But there's also this other aspect, this more human aspect. And I use the example from Christ praying to God on his last night. He asked God to sanctify them, us, the believers, by your truth, God's truth. Your word is truth. And what I pointed out about this is, men, our words are truth to our spouses. Our wives believe the things we tell her. We can sanctify them, purify them. We can encourage them. We can lift them up by our words, but we can also tear them down with our words. So we need to be careful that to sanctify this word, they see our word as truth, okay? Because, I mean, when they're the love of our life, we married them, and then we can say things that are very damaging to our spouses if we're not careful. And so we always need to recognize that even if we're saying it in just off the cuff, we need to be careful, be mindful of the things that we say to our wives. So now that was living as Christ as our example by how he loved the church. But now Paul moves on and brings it a little bit closer to home to maybe something we think we can follow ourselves as an example. And so what does Paul say? He says, so husbands, again, he's talking specifically to the husbands, ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. What's interesting about this is that the main noun in this verse has to do with the husband. And you could almost say that this verse should say more something like this. So husbands ought to love themselves as themselves. He who loves his wife loves himself. The word himself in that verse, in the literal translation, is in there like 5 times, and wife is in there once. Okay? So Paul's making a point of saying we should recognize that our wife is one with us, and we need to love them just like we love ourselves. And this ought means we owe it to them. We owe it to our wives to love them as ourselves. Okay, and I'm going to go a little deeper into how natural it should be on how men should love their wives. But I want to point out this image. A lot of men get this image in our brain, and women, that the wife, the whole ball and chain, right? We hear that a lot, and we think that concept. But I want to point out that this is not the image. This is not true. This should not be the way we look and see our wives, because they are not the ball and chain. And I'm going to see how it's not their fault, so to speak, that they're hitched to you, okay? And we're going to see that later in this passage, okay? And so talking about what does it mean to love your wife as yourself. This guy, Homer, in his Ephesians commentary, Homer I think was in the late 1800s, he says, as he, the husband, does not think about loving himself because it is natural, okay, so also should the husband's love of his wife be something that is as natural as loving himself. It shouldn't be a hard thing to love our wives as ourselves, because we don't think that hard about our loving ourselves. Okay, I wondered where to ask this question, but I think I'll throw it out here now. How many men out there know what your favorite car is? The make, the model, the color, the year. You know what your prize car is, right? Every man does. I don't know any guy that doesn't know what his favorite car is. Okay, those same men, I want to ask you, what's your wife's favorite flower? Okay, how many men in here know your wife's favorite flower? You don't have to expose yourself, I guess. I won't show it. And I can ask that question because I do know my wife's favorite flower, so I'm safe. But there's things that she wants to know. It's the tiger lily. Now I can buy it in a store. I just don't remember the name. The iris. Stargazer lily, that's what it is. Okay. Like I said, I can pick it out in the store. But that's the thing. This is the type of thing is that we need to recognize as men, we need to continually romance our wives. They don't ask for it. It's one of those things that I've learned is that if you have to ask how she wants to be romanced, she's going to say, I don't want to be romanced. Of course she is. So you're thinking, I'm off scot-free because she doesn't care. She doesn't care about romance. Trust me, the wife cares about romance, but she doesn't want to have to say what that romance is. Okay? You have to figure it out. You shouldn't stop. Okay? That was for free. Okay? So, husbands ought to love themselves as themselves. He who loves his wife loves himself. So Paul's just really pointing out, if you care about your own goodwill, your own good fortune, you're going to care about your own wife's good fortune as well. I mean, there's a phrase I hate, but there's a word of truth in it. There's that phrase that, how many have heard, a happy wife is a happy life? Right? There's truth to that. That doesn't mean that you cave to every whim and fancy of your wife so that you don't have problems in your marriage, because you're still the leader of the home. But again, there is a component of, if your wife is happy, your life is going to be going good. Okay? And it says from verse 29, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. Now, hated his own flesh. Here, this is why I say ourselves as an example, because Paul first really made it, for lack of a better way, a very spiritual connotation to how we are supposed to love our wives, because he compared it to how Christ loved the church. The wording here in the Greek is quite literally the flesh component of who we are. It is this. It is the body as opposed to the soul or the spirit. So it is our earthly needs, it is our earthly desires, it's our earthly things that we do. It doesn't necessarily have to do with our spirit or our soul. And he's saying that no one ever hated himself so much that they would, this word hate is to postpone in love or esteem or to slight. So you never slight yourself, you never do something to yourself. So if you're loving your wife as yourself, I guess where it boils down to me is you're not holding a grudge. You're not looking for a reason to be upset with your wife. If you guys have a disagreement, once it's over and you let it go. You don't hold it over their head. You don't hold a grudge. That's really key. When in a marriage, think about it. Marriage is supposed to be for life. Okay? And if you start holding grudges as soon as you say I do when something doesn't go the way you think it should, think 20 years down the road and you're hanging on to that's going to just corrupt and corrode your marriage if you don't let these things go. And it just builds and it builds and it builds, and then pretty soon your enemy's under the same roof. And so one of you need to remember the love that you had for your wife is the reason you married her, and remember that. Remember that. They always say leaders are supposed to take the blame for when things don't go right. You're the leader of the home. If things aren't going right in the marriage, look at yourself, don't look at your wife. Okay? It's that simple. Maybe she has some blame for it, but what leader does not take the blame for the whole problem? Right? That's where we're at. Is that if things aren't going right, we need to look to ourselves and maybe change ourselves before we continue on. Okay, and it says, so again, Paul writes to here in Colossians, he puts it very much simpler. He says, husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter towards them. This is where I was talking about not holding a grudge. If things aren't going right, if things don't go good, and you come to terms with it, truly come to terms. If you don't get your way, you don't get what you think it should go, but you concede the point and see the value of conceding the point, concede the point. Don't hang on to it. Don't just like, well, last week I said this, or last week I said that, so this week you should this, or that. It doesn't work that way. And so don't be bitter, because that bitterness is what's also going to drive a wedge between you and your marriage and your wife. And he says, but nourishes, and again, these are very physical attributes, but nourishes it. Okay, and one of the things I like to think about on nourishing is when Josie and I go out to eat, okay? Anybody, your wives, you always in agreement where you should go out to eat? Well, what I find out is that this idea of loving your wife as yourself, I'm going to see if I can sell. You might be looking at me like, what does this have to do with going out to eat besides eating a meal? It has to do with your love of wife. I can be an overbearing person, believe it or not. Okay? And what I have learned is that when we talk about going out to eat, just be like, well, what do you want? I go, well, what do you want? And then I'll think, well, I kind of want this, when I know she likes Indian, she likes Thai, and she likes curry. Who likes curry, right? I don't like those things, okay? And so what I find out is I have to make a conscious effort when we're talking about where to go to eat. I can pick 1,000,001 places that I like to go because I like to go there. I have to remember there's places that she likes to go, and she's very lovingly will be like, okay, we can go there, and I have to force myself because she won't enforce her will on me. It's not that she's afraid to say so. I don't think she is. But this idea I'm talking about is, as men, if we're going to lead, we need to recognize leading isn't just getting our way all the time. Okay? As leaders of the home, it's recognizing when we should concede something to the other party, the wife, okay? Because, face it, when she said I do, I remember that it kind of was a little bit of a blowback when Josie and I before we got married. She was saying she had to deeply consider if she wanted to give up the freedom she had to be married to me. I'm like, well, wait a minute, but you love me, right? But think about it. When a wife gets married, and under the biblical concept of marriage, to succeed her leadership of her boys, she had boys at that time, okay, and to give up and cede to God leading the family through me, that's a blow to a woman. That's a blow to a lady. And so you got to realize is that that's why as leaders we need to recognize that, men are dense. I'm sorry, women, men tend to be dense. And so we need to start learning to take the hints, okay? I also, though, on that regard, I tell Josie I don't take hints. I tell everybody I don't take hints. If you're hinting, you better just out and out tell me, because it doesn't work otherwise. Okay? And cherishes. I thought of a bunch of ways I could explain this word, but I think what really does it justice is just these pictures that I came up with. Okay? This is a husband. Hopefully they're all husbands, right? I'm assuming they're husbands and wives, right? This is what cherishing looks like. It's this idea of hugging and enveloping, of comforting, of consoling, of being, just a care and endeared to the person that you're married to. And what I like about these, you know why we don't have any of these pictures? Because we're always trying to take selfies. We don't have our own personal photographer to take these special moments, right? Okay, but this is what this idea that we want to cherish and hold and love our wives. Okay, that's what this cherish is about. Okay. And it's just as the Lord does the church, okay? That same thing. So Paul is really weaving this idea, these very physical, human-type natures, and he's weaving it very much into the whole spiritual aspect of what it is. And so just as the Lord does the church, so that we can use these physical natures, this human nature of things that we enjoy, we can recognize it and attribute it to what it means spiritually that Christ loves the church that way, okay? God recognizes we're human, and it's human things that make us think and recognize the benefit of serving God. He says, for we are members of his body and of his flesh and of his bones. Again, this is very much physical. This body, the flesh, the bones, is very much a physical human thing, but yet he's still trying to transcend the physical with the spiritual. And we're going to see that he uses this from a very passage that we have in Genesis, this idea, because we're going to be talking about the mystery here soon. We read that in the later verse. We're getting there. It says, for we are members of his body, of his flesh, and his bones. Okay? The church is. And this is the way we are supposed to be loving our wives. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 through 23, we see where woman was formed. It says, the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept. And he, God, took one of his ribs, Adam's, and closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord had taken from man, Adam, he made into a woman, and he brought her to man. That's the precursor. This is what happens when Adam wakes up, right? He says, and Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. This is that aspect. This is that physical but yet spiritual aspect that we have in marriage, that when we get together, when we have our wife, when our wife marries us, this is a very physical thing, but it has a very spiritual connotation to it because of the close-knit relationship we have with our spouses. Okay? And so that's what Paul's saying. All of us are members of Christ's body, his flesh, much like in the marriage. And again, this says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. You know what's interesting about this? This is the next verse. I took us to Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. This is a direct quote of Genesis verse 24. So the very physical nature of his bones, flesh of his flesh, and Christ, the church, we are his bone and his flesh. Now he's saying here, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The reason, the purpose of this, the whole point behind it is that a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. Okay, I don't know if I warned you, but I'm bringing this picture back. Okay, this is why we can't say the wife is the ball and chain. Okay, she does not have the keys. Okay, it says the man shall leave his father and be joined to his wife, right? He leaves his father and mother. The woman agreed to the situation that you put yourself into. I think sometimes I was in the military, and so I know a lot of horror stories about the way the men treat their wives in the military, and you hear a lot of things, and men can sometimes get together and just talk. No, like I said, they talk, the ball and chain, or the wife this, or the wife that. But it shouldn't be that way. It should be the opposite. We should be parading or heralding our wives to our friends and to our coworkers and things like that, because they're more important to us than our coworkers. They should be. They're more important to us than our friends. They should be, because the two shall become one flesh. That's how important the relationship between man and wife is. It's not just the best bud that you grew up with. It's the woman you chose to marry and spend your life with. Like I said, Your friend only has to, and your coworker only has to put up with you for a few hours a day, maybe 5 days a week, depending on how much you work. But your wife's got to put up with you all the other time, okay? And behind closed doors, we get familiar with each other to a point that it can cause conflict. But we should always remember that we love the individual that we marry, okay? And the two shall become one flesh. Okay, and this is where he's talking about, or Paul, we can now move on, where it says, this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. So we have this very human aspect of marriage, this very human thing called marriage, and that Christ, that God has used this, it's a great mystery. And if you remember a long time ago, I used this as an example to show a mystery, right? A mystery is a truth that was previously unknown, but has been revealed by God. Okay, so Paul is revealing this mystery to us, that this whole thing that we've been covering, that man should love his wife as Christ loved the church, this mystery, this thing, is that Christ and the church is a marriage, just like man and woman is a marriage, and Christ is the perfect fulfillment of marriage by being wed to the church. We are his bride, and that is the mystery. That is this idea that the whole thing, the whole package of what we see, and you'll see it in the so what. If you haven't read your bulletin, it's in there. is that we have this very physical thing that we can relate to relate to how Christ loves the church. It's a beautiful picture and image, and it started way back Genesis chapter 2. It's even before the fall in the Garden of Eden, where it says a man shall leave his father and mother, before Adam even had a father or a mother, right? So God put this in place in the very beginning, and it's one of its key aspects is to show how Christ loves his bride, the church, okay? And he says, so Paul's saying, I speak concerning Christ and the church. So rolling into the last verse, wrapping it up, we see, nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Nevertheless, another way, however, also is another way to say this, is what Paul is saying here is let each one of you in particular. So he kind of genericized it when he was talking to the men. He says, husbands, love your wives. And so in case you're wondering, it's like, well, Pastor Mike, he probably has a perfect marriage because he's the pastor. So they can use him as the example because, our marriage, it may not be quite what it should be. No. Paul's saying here, let each one of you in particular. And in particular means singled out an individual or of a specified group. So each and every one of you that is a husband, Paul is talking to. He's not talking to the pastor. He's not talking to the elder. He's not talking to a board member. He's talking to every husband out there, that each one of us in particular are to love our wives as ourselves. And that ourself, that whole idea is that we know what we like, and we should know the same about our wives. We should understand them, comprehend them, cherish them, nourish them. All those things are aspects of what we're supposed to do when we love our wives so that they feel loved. I think that's another problem that we have is like, well, of course I love my wife. I work 9 to 5 for her. I put food on the table. I this, I that. If your wife doesn't recognize that you love her, you're not loving your wife. Right? You hear that? If your wife does not recognize that she's loved, then you're not doing it right. That's the thing. You should be recognizing the way she needs to be loved. And then women, of course, wives, see that she respects her husband. And that's the hard aspect for the woman to do. Well, he doesn't deserve my respect. So what? The Bible doesn't say submit or respect your husband if he deserves it. It says respect your husband. Okay? And so those are the two aspects. Again, if your marriage is based on a foundation of God and Christ, these things work. Okay? Because the husband is focused on how to love his wife properly, and that therefore he's not abusing the idea of what submit means. He doesn't see it as being subservient. Okay? And the wife, if she is trying hard to please her maker and wants to serve God, then she is not being tolerant of her husband in submission, because we found out that tolerant, you may not agree or you're against it, you're just doing it because you have to. It doesn't work that way. When you're both serving God and you both want to please God, you're not worried that the other one is going to try to get the upper hand in their position that they have in the marriage. It just doesn't work that way. And so we have to have God at the center of our marriage, and then we're each recognizing that the other party is doing their best to do their part. That leads me to my so what. It says, God uses marriage to give us a glimpse of the love he has for his son and bride, the church. Through the human experience of marriage, we can begin to understand love, submission, and respect. And that's why I say this, we can begin to understand, not just we as men understanding love, but each party. The wife can understand love, submission, and respect. The husband can understand love, submission, and respect. The kids can understand love, submission, and respect. When we live it and we walk it the way God wants us to, we can get a perfect picture of what God, the intent behind God's plan, how he put it all together, and how there is a hierarchy, but that doesn't mean that you're subservient. It does not mean that you're a subordinate. It does not mean you're any less just because you're lower on the totem pole, because it's not a totem pole, okay? It's just a hierarchy. And so when we see that, we see how much God loved us. I mean, what husband, I don't know, I can't say that out loud. Anyway, we see what Christ did for us, right? When we look up the hierarchy chain, we see what God did for us. We see what Christ did for us. We see what God put into it. We saw the true submission of Christ in obedience to the Father. And so we have the perfect examples, and so we should recognize that those examples are what we should follow, because it just works, I guess. It just works, folks, when we're doing it with the right motive, which is to serve and honor Christ. The point to ponder. Husbands, how can you better show how you cherish your wife? I know a lot of these might seem similar that we've had over the course of these, but I picked on a specific aspect that I think is a little bit different than the prior one. Is how can you cherish your wife? I know sometimes, I'll confess, my wife doesn't think I hug her enough. Okay? I'm not a big hugger. Many of you have found that out, that I'm not a big hugger. It's not I'm opposed to hugging. It's just, it doesn't go through this thick head of mine. So, how can you cherish your wife? What is the things that you can do that will show her that you do really care and love her, and that she's not just a liability, right? How do you do that? And then wives, what is a way you can show respect for your husband? And that's a challenge for a woman as well, okay? And so for next week, finalize memorizing Ephesians 6:10 through 11, and then we're reading Colossians chapter 3. And interestingly enough, it turned out that chapter 3 of Colossians covers what we just covered in Ephesians chapter 5. Okay?